In 1875, something happened in the United States that should never have been revealed. What seemed like a simple event became a closely guarded secret for decades. But now, the truth is about to come out, and no one is prepared for what comes next. In 1875, the small town of Coldbrook, in the American Midwest, seemed like just another forgotten place. The dusty streets and wooden houses seemed to tell ancient stories, but nothing that caught the attention of passers-by. However, young Henry Calloway, a curious history student, had something in mind that most of the town's inhabitants would never dare to pursue. He wanted to unravel the mystery behind an event that until then had never been discussed publicly. Something as old as the town itself, but buried in the shadows, carefully hidden by previous generations. Henry lived with his grandmother, an elderly woman who somehow knew more than she let on about the town's past. When he began to take an interest in the subject, his grandmother made a point of warning him, "There are secrets that shouldn't be unearthed, Henry. Some mysteries are like dust under the rug. It's best to leave them there." But Henry's curiosity only grew, and he began questioning the few remaining older residents about what had happened in the year 1875. That's when he found a crucial clue. An old diary belonging to a man named Elias McDermott, who had mysteriously disappeared that year. The diary was kept in the attic of the town library, where Henry often spent time. The first pages were covered in hurried handwriting, and the contents seemed to refer to political, social, and personal events that were closely linked to the founding of the town. But something in that diary didn't add up. Some passages were blurred, others incomplete. One in particular mentioned a secret meeting between influential figures in Coldbrook, but without revealing what was discussed or decided there. This mention of the midnight meeting became Henry's starting point for understanding what had really happened that fateful year. When he told his grandmother about the discovery, she didn't hide her discomfort. "You don't know what you're asking for, boy," she said firmly, looking directly into his eyes. "Elias McDermott wasn't an ordinary man. He got involved with powerful people, things that aren't talked about. You need to stop now, before it's too late." But the more he tried to understand, the more the pieces seemed to fit together, creating a grim picture of something big and dark that had occurred in the city. Henry knew that the secret he was trying to uncover was not something the city wanted to remember, but he couldn't stop. The obsession with the mystery took hold of him, and soon he was asking uncomfortable questions of people who seemed to want to forget that period in Coldbrook's history. From that moment on, Henry's journey would become dangerous. He grew closer to figures who would prefer the past to remain hidden, and his search for the truth attracted the attention of powerful people who would do anything to ensure the story remained buried. But who was behind it all? What really happened in 1875 that made an entire city prefer to remain silent about its own past? As Henry began to unearth deeper information, he didn't know he was approaching an inevitable confrontation. What he discovered about the town's history seemed to undermine his own understanding of everything around him. The small town of Coldbrook, with its peaceful facades and quiet streets, was about to be thrown into a maelstrom of revealed secrets, past betrayals, and a truth that would be harder to accept than he ever imagined. Do you think some stories should stay in the past, or does the truth always need to be revealed? Leave your opinion in the comments. Daily life in Coldbrook seemed to run on in an unaltered routine. But what Henry was discovering about the town's inner workings revealed something very different. As he investigated further, he began to understand the complex relationships that shaped the community and how the town's past influenced everyone's lives, even in the simplest choices. Everything was intertwined in an almost invisible way, like the roots of an ancient tree that, when pulled, reveal a secret underworld full of dangers. Henry soon realized that the town wasn't just a collection of ordinary characters. Each seemed to carry a burden, a secret or a story they couldn't tell. Young Alice Thornton, for example, a respected teacher at the local school, had a strange way of avoiding any mention of 1875. When Henry mentioned the date once, she froze, and her reaction was so strong that he knew he had touched on something sensitive. Although she was a free-spirited woman and much admired in the town, Alice was connected to something much bigger than she was willing to reveal. During a casual conversation, she commented almost indifferently, "Some things, Henry, are better left unknown. What you're seeking might make you lose more than you realize." Alice would later become a key figure in Henry's search, but at first she was an enigma, a piece of a puzzle he couldn't yet understand. Her eyes reflected more than they knew, and her reserved demeanor sparked a growing curiosity in Henry. She knew more than she let on, and Henry soon realized that Alice, like many in the city, was caught in a web of old lies. On the other hand, there was Sheriff Samuel Graves, a middle-aged man who seemed to have a pragmatic view of the town and its inhabitants. Samuel was not easily impressed and always maintained a firm, almost immutable posture. However, when Henry asked him about the story of 1875, the sheriff's expression changed, and he fell silent for a moment. "I don't know what you're trying to find out, but there are certain things that aren't worth digging up. You think you're close to the truth, but I bet you're not even close to what really happened," he said in a grave tone, before quickly changing the subject. Henry soon realized that the town wasn't just a small community with ordinary stories of work and family, but rather a network of hidden interests and characters playing their own games, protecting something bigger. When he began researching the connections between the town's founding families and the political figures of 1875, he stumbled upon a whole new world. He discovered that Alice Thornton's father, Jonathan, was one of the most powerful men in Coldbrook at the time, someone with enough power to influence political and social decisions. But his name had been erased from history. No street, building, or square bore his name, which was suspicious, to say the least, for someone who had been so influential. Over time, Henry also found old records of a series of protests that occurred in 1875, a silent revolt against something being imposed by the city's elite. The working class was beginning to question the orders coming from above, and the year 1875 was becoming increasingly crucial in the formation of the new Coldbrook. However, what was being protested was still unclear to Henry. There was something deeper that no one wanted to talk about, something that went beyond political and economic interests. The city, seemingly peaceful and safe, revealed itself to be a place full of secrets and mysteries. Each new step Henry took led him to better understand how much the events of 1875 had shaped the city. But at the same time, it distanced him further and further from the truth. He found himself facing a dilemma. The more he investigated, the further he strayed from his initial goal of finding clear answers. The city, with its serene facades and tarnished past, became dangerous territory for someone like Henry, seeking to unearth a truth everyone preferred to forget. But he couldn't stop now. The pieces were almost all in place, and he knew that the story of 1875 was only the beginning of something much bigger. Do you think a city's or a family's past should be kept secret, or should the truth always be revealed? Share your thoughts in the comments. As Henry's search for the truth intensified, the conflict began to deepen, revealing complex layers he had never imagined. He had begun investigating with the intention of understanding what had happened in 1875, but soon realized that there was more at stake than just the city's past. What he was unearthing could have serious consequences for him and everyone around him. Henry's discoveries began to touch on sensitive points, and he soon realized that the mystery wasn't just about Coldbrook's history, but also about himself. As he sifted through more documents, interviews, and old records, he found evidence that Elias McDermott's disappearance in 1875 was related to something much bigger than he had imagined. Elias wasn't just a simple historian, as Henry initially thought, but a key figure in a radical political movement that threatened to overthrow the city's power structures. The problem was that Henry was no longer alone in his investigation. As he delved deeper, he began to realize that someone was watching his every move. Sheriff Samuel Graves, who had initially warned Henry, began to appear in his life in an increasingly threatening manner. He was always present, asking indirect questions about what Henry was doing, and his presence began to create a growing sense of distrust. There was something about the sheriff's demeanor that didn't seem right, as if he were getting in Henry's way without a clear motive. On a cold afternoon, Henry met Alice Thornton at a local cafe. She was visibly agitated, her gaze uneasy and her hands trembling as she held her teacup. "Henry, you're meddling with something you can't control," she said, glancing around before continuing. "I don't know what else to tell you. Everyone is trying to protect you, but you don't understand that the truth can destroy more than you imagine. Some things are better left in the past." But Henry was determined. He felt he was close to something big, something that could finally reveal what had happened in 1875 and, more importantly, what was being hidden. He couldn't stop now. His drive for justice and truth had taken him so far that he could no longer turn back. Each new clue pushed him closer to the heart of the conspiracy, and he knew the stakes were rising. In his investigations, Henry found a mysterious letter written by Elias McDermott before his disappearance, addressed to a name he had never heard before: Jonathan Thornton, Alice's father. The letter mentioned a secret meeting, a crucial decision made in 1875 that had altered the course of the city forever. But the letter's contents were coded, and Henry became obsessed with deciphering Elias's enigmatic words. He spent sleepless nights trying to find a key to understanding what lay behind those words. Meanwhile, the antagonists were closing in. Henry didn't know exactly who was behind it all, but he was beginning to realize that his enemy wasn't a single individual, but rather a system, a network of people who had manipulated the events of 1875 to ensure the secret remained hidden. Every time he took a step toward the truth, new threats emerged, and now he knew he could trust no one anymore. On the night he finally managed to decipher the letter, he was awakened by a strange sound coming from outside his house. Looking out the window, he saw the figure of someone moving quickly, and before he could react, a shadow disappeared into the darkness. Without wasting any time, Henry ran to the location indicated in the letter, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place no one had visited in decades. He knew that there lay the key to understanding what had really happened in 1875. Upon arriving at the warehouse, Henry was met with a deathly silence. Everything was still, but he sensed that something was about to happen. He entered cautiously, his feet barely making a sound on the creaking wooden floor. As he turned the corner, a figure appeared in the darkness, the silhouette of a man he immediately recognized: Sheriff Samuel Graves. "Do you really think you can figure all this out, Henry?" Samuel said, a grim expression on his face. "What you're looking for isn't something that should be found. The past isn't a safe place for you to go." Henry took a step back, but before he could respond, the sheriff stepped forward, blocking his exit. A confrontation was inevitable. But what Henry didn't know was that the truth he was about to uncover was far more dangerous than he imagined, and could forever change how he saw the town and even himself. Do you think that, when seeking the truth, there's a point where it's better to give up in order to protect yourself and others? Leave your opinion in the comments. Henry's main conflict with the figures who control Coldbrook's secrets intensified. But as he progressed, new layers of mystery began to emerge, further complicating his search for the truth. It was no longer just about Elias McDermott and his disappearance in 1875, but about the very fabric of the town that was being slowly revealed. Subplots began to intertwine, exposing secrets that affected not only the powerful, but also ordinary citizens. Amidst the growing tension, Henry began to notice that some people in Coldbrook were acting strangely. Alice Thornton, despite her efforts to distance herself from him, seemed increasingly involved, more so than he had imagined. In one of their most tense encounters, she told him about her own dilemma. Her father, Jonathan, had been deeply involved in the local politics of 1875, but had disappeared shortly after the events that marked the town. Alice knew that by seeking the truth about the past, she could destroy her father's memory and his public image, something she was unwilling to allow. But she also knew that the town harbored a secret that could not be ignored. "If you continue, Henry, you will discover more than you are prepared to understand," Alice said in a low, almost pleading voice. "I warned you." However, Henry couldn't afford to stop. His quest was driven more by a sense of justice than by any loyalty to Alice or his town. He knew that what was at stake was far greater than any personal allegiance. The powerful figures who manipulated Coldbrook's fate and who were behind what happened in 1875 were not just local authorities, but members of a secret power network. People who had manipulated historical events for their own ends. Meanwhile, the city was beginning to show signs of a deeper unrest. Rumors of a series of demonstrations against the local leadership began to circulate. Social tensions, fueled by resentment from the lower classes, were growing, and Henry began to realize that the repression of 1875 had not been just an isolated event, but the first in a series of decisions made by those in power to keep the masses under control. The old abandoned warehouse where he had had his confrontation with the sheriff was now occupied by a group of people who saw the truth very differently from Henry. They viewed his findings as a direct threat to what remained of the established order. Among these new players was Charles Whitaker, an old friend of Henry's family, who now led a dissident movement within the city. Charles, like Henry, was beginning to question what had happened in 1875, but his intentions were very different. While Henry sought the truth to understand and heal the wounds of the past, Charles wanted to use it to turn the tables, dismantle the power structure, and seize leadership of the city for himself. "What you're doing, Henry, is digging the city's own grave," Charles warned with a sinister smile. "But when all this is over, whoever has the power to rewrite history will benefit." Henry's dilemma was now more complex than ever. He found himself at a crossroads between the morality of his mission and the forces surrounding him, forces manipulating the very past he was trying to uncover. What he didn't know, and what Charles had realized before, was that the truth he sought would not bring justice, but rather a new cycle of power, a shifting of pieces on Coldbrook's political chessboard. In the end, everyone seemed to be manipulated by an invisible force that was beyond individual intentions. However, there was more. During a visit to the old Coldbrook Town Hall, Henry found documents hidden in a secret compartment. There, among contracts and records, he found a list of names, a group of people who, in 1875, had been bribed or threatened to silence anyone who opposed the local government. But at the top of that list was the name of someone Henry never imagined, his own mother, Elizabeth Calloway. This explained many things. His mother had mysteriously disappeared shortly after his birth, but now, looking at that yellowed paper, Henry realized she had been one of the central figures in the attempt to protect the town's secrets. This secret involved more than he had ever known. He knew he was touching on something far bigger than anyone could have anticipated. The struggle to uncover the truth was no longer a simple matter of curiosity, but a battle to confront the powerful forces that manipulated the lives of everyone in Coldbrook. Do you believe that trying to unearth the secrets of the past can lead to becoming part of a new conspiracy? Leave your opinions in the comments. Henry was becoming increasingly immersed in the complexity of the mystery, but what he didn't know was that his journey was about to take an irreversible turn. The search for the truth had placed him in the eye of a storm, and the last vestiges of safety he thought he had were quickly erased. When he finally managed to unravel the enigma of Elias McDermott's letter, what he found was not just a clue to the city's past, but a revelation that would change his life forever. The secret kept in 1875 was not only linked to the town, but to Henry's own destiny. The words he had read in Elias's letter pointed directly to his mother, Elizabeth Calloway. She had not been a simple victim of a local conspiracy, but the central figure behind a web of political intrigue that shaped the course of Coldbrook. His mother, a silent and enigmatic woman, had been involved in a series of secret negotiations that, unbeknownst to Henry, determined the future of the town and, in a way, his own. But the revelation didn't stop there. Elias's letter also revealed the true reason behind Elias McDermott's disappearance in 1875. It wasn't a simple accident or error in judgment, but a planned execution by an unknown force, linked to the same power groups that controlled the city to this day. The revelation that his mother was deeply involved in something so dark was a devastating blow to Henry. He had always known she had her own secrets, but he had never imagined she was at the center of such a risky and dangerous conflict. While Henry processed the implications of these revelations, a new figure appeared in his life, bringing even more confusion to his already tumultuous world. A mysterious woman, elegant in appearance but with an air of urgency and mystery, appeared in Coldbrook. Her name was Margaret Hale, a historian and writer who, it seemed, had been hired by someone to write the official history of Coldbrook. But contrary to what one might expect from a neutral researcher, Margaret seemed to have her own agenda. She sought out Henry, claiming to know more about his mother than he ever imagined. She told him that if he wanted to understand his mother's true role in all of this, he would need to hear her side of the story. Margaret claimed to be one of the last people to have contact with Elizabeth Calloway before her disappearance. "You don't understand, Henry," Margaret said, a grave expression on her face. "What your mother did wasn't just to protect the city, but to protect you. She sacrificed everything so that you would have the chance to grow up away from all this." Henry felt a mixture of anger and confusion. He didn't know if he could trust Margaret, but the idea of finally understanding his mother's role drew him in like a magnet. He followed her clues, growing increasingly suspicious that he was being manipulated by yet another pawn in the city's web of intrigue. On a rainy night, while Henry was alone in his house, a pivotal event occurred. The front door burst open, and he found himself face to face with a familiar figure, Sheriff Samuel Graves. This time, however, the sheriff was no longer trying to subtly intimidate him. He was there to end Henry's search once and for all. "You shouldn't have gone this far, Henry," Samuel said in a cold voice. "Now, you have no choice. The truth you're seeking isn't something you can understand or control. You should never have started looking for it." Before Henry could react, the sheriff grabbed him by the shoulders, pushing him back forcefully. It was clear he wasn't there for a friendly chat. Samuel Graves had his own reasons for keeping secrets buried, and now he was willing to do whatever it took to protect those secrets. But Henry was no longer willing to back down. What he had discovered about his mother and about the town was a point of no return. He knew he couldn't stop now, regardless of the threats he faced. The confrontation between him and Samuel had become inevitable. But as the sheriff pressed him, Henry realized he was dealing with more than just a law enforcement officer. Samuel Graves was involved in something far darker, a conspiracy that went beyond anything he had ever imagined. In the moment of desperation, Henry used what remained of his strength to push the sheriff and flee the house. But as he ran through the dark streets of Coldbrook, He knew that something much bigger was lurking. The truth he sought so anxiously was further away than ever. What he had discovered so far was only a piece of a much more complex puzzle. He didn't know what the future held for him, but one thing was certain: the town of Coldbrook would never be the same again. Do you think people have the right to discover the truth about their past, even if it might cause more pain and destruction? Leave your opinion in the comments. The impact of the latest revelations began to weigh on Henry in ways he had never imagined. The desperate escape that night, the confrontation with the sheriff, and the knowledge that his own mother had been the key to such a deep conspiracy left him in a state of shock. But at the same time, they awakened him to the truth that he had crossed a point of no return. There was no going back to the simple, innocent life he used to know in Coldbrook. Henry's actions were now in an unstoppable spiral, and the consequences were beginning to unfold. In the following days, the atmosphere in the city began to change. Tensions that had previously been only palpable were now open and visible. People who had previously seemed friendly began to avoid him, and the few who dared to speak to Henry did so with suspicious glances, as if he were the bearer of an evil about to spread. Those he considered friends, such as Alice Thornton and Charles Whitaker, began to distance themselves, leaving him increasingly isolated. The city, once small and peaceful, became an invisible prison around him. Alice, who had always been a close figure, now avoided any contact with Henry. In an attempt to get an answer, Henry went to her house, but she wouldn't let him in. "You don't understand, Henry. They won't let you continue," Alice said, her voice heavy with worry. "I tried to warn you, but you were blinded by your need to find the truth. Now nobody is safe anymore." Her gaze seemed to weigh on him, a mixture of sorrow and fear. Alice was no longer just an ally, but someone who also had much to lose. She knew that if the truth were exposed, her own past and her relationship with her father would be irrevocably destroyed. Meanwhile, Charles Whitaker reappeared, but in an unexpected way. Henry found him in a local bar, where Charles was visibly disturbed, more so than ever before. "Do you have any idea what you're doing, Henry?" he asked, his eyes filled with frustration. "The truth you're seeking won't set us free. It will destroy us. Everything is much more interconnected than you realize. You're playing with fire, and you won't be the only one who gets burned." Henry felt a wave of anger and confusion. Charles seemed not to understand. He wasn't seeking the truth merely to expose the powerful or destroy the power structure. For Henry, it was a matter of justice. It was a non-negotiable need to understand what happened, why his mother became involved in something so complex, and what role each piece played in the great game of intrigue that had unfolded in 1875. However, the deeper he delved, the more he realized that the truth would bring not only revelations, but also irreparable ruptures. At the same time, the town of Coldbrook was beginning to react in unforeseen ways. In one of the secret meetings Henry had with other dissidents, he was confronted with the idea that the entire town was being controlled by invisible forces, far beyond anyone's ability to dismantle. Those who had manipulated the events of 1875 were not just local figures, but part of a much larger scheme, with ramifications that spread across various layers of society. Authorities such as Sheriff Samuel Graves were not just isolated villains, but essential pieces in a much vaster power game. Meanwhile, Sheriff Graves's reaction intensified. Henry began to realize his life was in danger. He was no longer just a young man seeking answers, but a threat to the town's status quo. The local police began to move more aggressively, their movements more organized. As the net closed in, Henry became more desperate to understand the extent of the conspiracy, but also more aware that he himself was being hunted. He could no longer trust anyone, not even Margaret Hale, the historian who had sought to offer him information about his mother. After a meeting with her, Henry realized that, behind her words of sympathy, Margaret was using his search for the truth to fuel her own ambitions. What seemed to be genuine collaboration now revealed itself as a strategy to manipulate Henry, placing him directly at the center of a web of interests and betrayals. Henry, once immersed in the pursuit of justice, was now completely engulfed in a fight for survival. He found himself in a game where every move only plunged him deeper into a web of lies and manipulation, and any attempt to uncover the truth seemed irrevocably linked to the destruction of his own life. The city, which had once seemed to have a sense of normalcy, was now on the verge of collapse, and Henry knew he had a central role in that downfall. In his quest, he was not only unearthing the city's past, but also dismantling the fragile security structure in which everyone lived. With each revelation, he became more vulnerable, and the consequences of his search for the truth were beginning to become clear to everyone around him. Do you think that, in the pursuit of truth, it's possible to predict the consequences for oneself and others, or does everything become unpredictable? Leave your opinion in the comments. The pressure on Henry had intensified. The city, which he once considered his safe haven, was now becoming a labyrinth of intrigue and persecution. Each step he took in his search for the truth seemed to push him further into an abyss of uncertainty. However, amidst all the turmoil, something was beginning to shift within him. The fear and insecurity that had initially overwhelmed him began to give way to something more powerful: determination and courage. At his lowest point, Henry isolated himself in a place he never imagined, seeking refuge: the old Coldbrook warehouse, the very same one that had been the scene of so many revelations and confrontations. There, between the cold walls and the vestiges of a forgotten era, he felt for the first time the weight of the journey he had chosen to follow. But at the same time, he realized there was no turning back. He knew the town was indeed against him, but he also understood that this was the only way to confront what had been hidden for so long. It was at that moment that he made an irrevocable decision. He would not only uncover the truth, but also confront the forces that had manipulated the city and its history for so long. It was no longer just about his mother, nor about the disappearance of Elias McDermott. Now his fight was for justice, not only for himself, but for all those who had been victims of the silence and oppression of the powerful. Henry's transformation wasn't instantaneous, but gradual. Over the following weeks, he began to reassess his approach. The pursuit of truth had driven him to a point of obsession, but he finally understood that the only way to survive this power game was to become more than just a spectator. He needed to be an active force in the fight against the corruption that was taking over Coldbrook. It was in this process of reassessment that he discovered the true value of resistance. He was not alone. Charles Whitaker, who had previously warned him about the dangers of truth, ended up becoming a key ally. Although their intentions differed, Henry recognized that Charles had something to offer: a strategic vision of what lay behind the city's curtains. Together, they began to plan more coordinated actions to expose what had happened in 1875 and the role of the local elite in manipulating events. Charles revealed that, over the years, he had amassed a network of allies who shared the desire to dismantle the oppressive system. Henry now knew he couldn't do it alone. Meanwhile, Alice Thornton, who had distanced herself from him, also began to reconsider her own actions. Although loyalty to her father's memory still prevented her from taking a clear stance, she began to see the cost of silence. Her city was crumbling, and she knew she could no longer hide in the shadows. She sought out Henry, not with promises of help, but with a quiet offer of support. She wasn't ready to expose the whole truth, but she was willing to help him find ways to undermine the power structure that prevented him from acting. "I can't bring my father back, Henry," Alice said privately, her eyes downcast, "but I can help you take down those who destroyed him. I can't be the hero of this story, but I can be a part of it. Henry realized that as his journey progressed, he was not only uncovering his town's past, but also forging alliances that would help him challenge the forces that controlled Coldbrook. The fight he waged was no longer just for a personal truth, but for a collective truth, one that could change the course of his town's history. Over the following days, Henry and his allies began to devise bolder plans. The first major action was a public demonstration, something none of them had imagined possible before. Although local authorities tried to suppress the demonstration, the simple act of resistance was a significant milestone. The city was finally waking up to what was happening in the shadows, and Henry became the central figure of this movement. It was an experience of personal overcoming, as Henry went from a frightened and confused man searching for answers to a determined leader ready to confront everything that had destroyed the truth. He was no longer seeking forgiveness or justice for himself, but for all those who had been silenced by oppression and fear. However, the road ahead was still full of obstacles. Sheriff Samuel Graves, in his growing paranoia, intensified his attacks against Henry and his allies. But contrary to what he expected, the persecutions did not break the resistance. On the contrary, they strengthened the movement. Each act of repression brought more support from citizens who until then had been afraid to act. Henry and his allies discovered that, in the end, the greatest power of all was the courage to confront the forces that controlled the destiny of Coldbrook. As the city's shadows rose, Henry felt a new kind of strength. He was no longer a man at the mercy of the secrets of the past. He had become a symbol of resistance, living proof that, even against the greatest adversity, the truth could prevail. Do you believe that true strength comes from personal achievement, or from everyone uniting in pursuit of a common goal? Leave your opinion in the comments. The town of Coldbrook was in turmoil. The movement started by Henry, with the support of his allies, was growing every day, spreading throughout the community. The pressure on local authorities, especially Sheriff Samuel Graves, was mounting. Henry knew he could no longer postpone the final confrontation. The town, with all its buried secrets, was about to be exposed, and the forces that controlled Coldbrook's destiny would do anything to prevent the truth from being revealed. The last piece of the puzzle was falling into place, but Henry also knew he was racing against time. The demonstrations had intensified, and with them the city's resistance to the powerful was becoming more visible and fierce. Sheriff Graves and other members of the local elite had tried to discredit the movement, but the truth was spreading, and the city could no longer be manipulated as before. Information was leaking out, and little by little, people began to realize what had really happened in 1875. Henry and his allies, now united as never before, knew they needed to act quickly before the movement was stifled. Sheriff Graves had taken drastic measures to try to contain the demonstrations, ordering arbitrary arrests and intimidating anyone who dared to challenge his authority. But Henry did not back down. He was not only fighting for the truth, but for the freedom of Coldbrook. It was then, through a confidential conversation with Margaret Hale, that he discovered the turning point was near. She revealed crucial information. A secret event was being planned by local authorities, a closed meeting that would bring together the city's leading figures. This meeting would be the last attempt to manipulate and control Coldbrook's history, a final effort to keep the secrets buried and ensure that no one knew the truth about 1875. "Henry, you need to be there," Margaret said, with urgency in her voice. "If you don't go, everything you've done so far will be in vain. They'll erase everything, and you'll have no chance to stop the lie from perpetuating itself. You have to confront them in front of everyone." This event, scheduled for the following night, would be the climax of Henry's struggle. He knew it was now or never. The meeting would be held in a secluded mansion on the outskirts of town, where Coldbrook's elite would gather to discuss the future of their city. Henry knew that if he could expose the secrets at that moment, he could finally break the cycle of silence and repression that had governed Coldbrook for decades. But the preparations for that night were anything but simple. Tension hung in the air, and every move was meticulously planned. Charles Whittaker, with his contacts, managed to infiltrate some allies among the meeting's guests, people who, out of fear or loyalty, had not yet rebelled. Alice Thornton, though hesitant, decided to join Henry once more. She knew that the truth, however painful, needed to be revealed so that the city could finally be free. In the days leading up to the meeting, Henry spent sleepless nights preparing for what would be the final confrontation. He had gathered evidence proving that the authorities had manipulated the events of 1875, bribing people, fabricating lies, and destroying lives to maintain power in their hands. He knew that by exposing all this, his life, and perhaps the lives of his allies, would be at risk, but the desire for justice outweighed any fear. On the last day before the meeting, Henry sat alone, reflecting on everything that had happened. He looked out the window, the town of Coldbrook before him, now darker and more menacing than ever. But he also saw something more. The possibility of change. He knew that the battle for truth was not just his, but that of all those who had been silenced, oppressed, and forgotten over the years. He was no longer the same man who had begun this journey. He had grown, not only as a person, but as a leader. The determination that had once seemed a weakness was now his greatest strength. He wasn't just going to that meeting to reveal secrets. He was going to challenge the entire system, to break the chain that had imprisoned Coldbrook in its lies for so long. Alongside his allies, Henry prepared for what would be the greatest test of his life. The future of Coldbrook depended on a single night, and he knew that regardless of what happened, the town would never be the same. Do you believe that in situations like this, it's more important to face the truth head-on, even if it brings dangers, or is it better to protect oneself and maintain the status quo? Leave your opinion in the comments. The night of the confrontation finally arrived, and Coldbrook had never been so thick with tension. The meeting was about to begin at the isolated mansion on the outskirts of town, a place that, for years, had been the heart of secret decisions and manipulation. For Henry, this would be his last chance to expose the truth he had been unearthing since the beginning of his journey. The risk was immense, but he knew he couldn't back down. Now, he was ready to challenge those who had ruled the town in a dark silence, deciding everyone's fate with their lies. Henry and his allies, under the careful guidance of Charles Whittaker and with the collaboration of Alice Thornton, were infiltrated into the event. The plan was simple but dangerous: to invade the meeting and expose, before all those present, the evidence of corruption, manipulation, and the crucial role of local authorities in 1875. Every detail had been meticulously planned, and the tension was at its peak. When Henry entered the mansion, the scene was more impressive than he had imagined. The opulent decor contrasted sharply with the air, heavy with lies and secrets. The hall was filled with important people, some familiar and others shadowy figures he had never seen before. Sheriff Samuel Graves was there, with his imposing posture and watchful eyes, while Margaret Hale, who had also infiltrated the house, stood in a distant corner, observing. Henry knew that any mistake now could be fatal. He and his allies positioned themselves, waiting for the right moment to act. The meeting began with an air of formality as the members of Coldbrook's elite discussed the city's future, without the slightest concern for the lives they had destroyed along the way. But beneath the carefully chosen words, Henry felt the weight of lies and manipulation. He knew that if it weren't for this meeting, no one would ever know what had really happened in 1875. History would continue to be distorted, and the city of Coldbrook would remain under the control of those who profited from collective ignorance. The moment arrived when the meeting's host, one of Graves's closest allies, took the stage to give a speech. The room fell into absolute silence, And it was at that moment that Henry made the decision that would change everything. With a swift movement, he stood up and, without hesitation, laid out the evidence in front of everyone. In 1875, Coldbrook was manipulated. The local authorities, including Sheriff Graves, conspired to keep a secret that, to this day, destroys lives. Henry said, his voice firm, each word cutting through the heavy air of the room. You destroyed innocent lives and hid the truth, but today I have brought the truth to light. Henry's words reverberated through the mansion. The silence was broken by murmurs of surprise and shock. The people who were there, accustomed to talking about power and manipulation, were now being confronted with something they had never expected. The truth they had tried to bury. Samuel Graves, who until then had appeared calm and composed, became visibly disturbed. He stood up, glaring at Henry with growing anger. "You're destroying the city, Henry!" he shouted, trying to regain his composure. "You have no idea what you're doing. People don't need to know the truth. They need order. You're putting everyone in danger." But Henry didn't back down. He knew the sheriff was trying to shift the blame onto others, as he always had. But now there was no denying what was right in front of everyone. He had brought the evidence, documents, letters, testimonies, and each one revealed the web of corruption that had been woven over the years. The room began to stir, and Henry felt the tension rising. He knew this was the decisive moment. He couldn't back down now. It was then that something unexpected happened. Margaret Hale, who had been there from the beginning, stood up. She walked over to Henry, and the room fell into absolute silence. But instead of supporting Henry's claims, she did something surprising. She turned to the sheriff and declared, "I knew about this all along, Henry. But the truth you seek won't liberate Coldbrook. It will destroy it. What you're doing is war, not healing." Margaret revealed that, as a historian, she had been hired to create the official version of Coldbrook's history, but her findings had placed her in a moral dilemma. She knew what had happened, but she also knew that, without genuine change, Coldbrook would descend into a bloody revolution. The town wasn't ready to hear the truth. This statement left Henry stunned. He felt a mixture of betrayal and confusion. Margaret had been his ally, but now she seemed to be manipulating the very forces he was trying to expose. What she said made sense, but at the same time, Henry knew he couldn't let the city live in his lies. And it was at that moment that the room exploded. People began to stand up, shouting, and chaos took over the meeting. The confrontation between the forces of the old power and the search for truth was unfolding before their eyes, and no one seemed to know how it would end. But Henry knew that, regardless of the outcome, the city would never be the same again. Do you think that by seeking the truth, it's truly possible to change a city or a society? Or is the power of lies so strong that any attempt at change will be destroyed? Leave your opinion in the comments. The chaos that followed Henry's revelation was inevitable. The mansion, once tranquil and full of powerful people, became a symbolic battleground between truth and the silence that had dominated Coldbrook for so long. Shouts and arguments filled the room as people tried to distance themselves from what had just happened. Sheriff Graves, out of control, shouted orders for the mansion's security to control the situation, but the truth Henry exposed spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the town. Local authorities tried to discredit the movement and the evidence that had been presented, but it was too late. The town of Coldbrook was already waking up. Those who had previously been complacent began to question everything they had believed, and little by little, the manipulation began to crumble. The truth had been told, and now no one could return to the comfortable state of ignorance that had reigned for decades. Henry, however, knew the repercussions would be profound. The city would never be the same again. Margaret Hale's words about the possibility of destruction began to materialize. Many of Henry's allies, including Alice and Charles, were forced to make difficult decisions, facing not only old enemies, but also resistance from the citizens themselves, who were not ready to embrace the truth. There were those who feared the disruption of the status quo and the disorder that would come with the revelation. Fear and anger were palpable, and the city's future remained uncertain. But Henry knew there was no turning back. The truth, however painful, had to be faced. He had fulfilled his role in revealing what had happened in 1875, but the cost was high. He had lost much: the trust of former allies, the peace of his city, and probably his own safety. But at the same time, he had gained something irreplaceable: the freedom to live without the lies that had surrounded him. In the days that followed, Coldbrook witnessed a wave of change. The town began to rebuild, albeit turbulently. Many of the old leaders were ousted, while new groups began to form, based on transparency and a desire for a different future. But this rebuilding was not easy, and many remained divided. The trauma of the truth was too heavy to overcome quickly. Henry, for his part, left the city not as a victor, but as someone who had fulfilled his duty. He knew that what remained for Coldbrook was now a collective journey, in which truth and redemption needed to be earned every day. He had planted the seed of change, but the healing process would be long and painful. As he gazed at the city one last time, Henry realized that the fight for truth never ends. With each step taken, new challenges arise, and the price of freedom is constantly negotiated. But he also knew that in leaving Coldbrook behind, he carried with him something unbreakable: the certainty that sometimes the only way to heal a city or a heart is by tearing out once and for all the lies that poison it. Do you think that after so many lies, the city could truly heal, or are the scars too permanent? Leave your opinion in the comments. Years later, Coldbrook had changed. The weight of the lies that once dominated the town was still felt, but the truth had begun a transformation that few imagined possible. Henry, far from his hometown, reflected on the journey that had led him to confront the past, and in doing so, open a new chapter for everyone. The truth, though difficult and painful, had become the key to freedom. Coldbrook continued its journey, stronger and more aware of its own flaws, but finally free from the silence that had imprisoned it for so long. Do you believe that truth always leads to freedom, or can it sometimes imprison us even further? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and connected with Henry's journey, be sure to share your thoughts. The truth can be painful, but it's essential for change. Leave your comment below, share with your friends, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo and invite us to reflect on what really matters. Don't miss the next chapters of this journey of discovery, struggle, and overcoming. Let's continue searching for the truth together, no matter the cost. Your voice matters. Like, share, and join the conversation.